The thing about trust is that you never notice the weight of it until someone puts it down. You carry it for years without thinking about it, the way you carry your own heartbeat, constant and unremarkable and completely invisible until the moment it isn't. I carried that weight for 61 years without ever once stopping to feel how much it cost me. And then, on a Thursday night in March, standing in the dark hallway of my own house in my socks, with my hand on the wall and my son's voice coming low and careful through the door to the garage, I felt every single ounce of it at once. My name is Thomas Calloway. I am 61 years old. I spent 34 years building a small commercial construction company from a single truck and a borrowed tool belt into something real and solid and mine, and I am the kind of man who believes, with the specific conviction of someone who learned it the hard way, that the most important thing you can build in this life has nothing to do with concrete or steel. I have one son. His name is Daniel. And before I tell you what I heard in that garage on a Thursday night in March, I need you to understand exactly who Daniel Calloway was to me. Because this story only means what it means if you know that first. Daniel was born on a February morning 29 years ago, when the world outside the hospital window was white and still. And the nurse put him in my arms, and he looked up at me with those dark and serious eyes. And I understood, in a way that rearranged everything permanently, that I would spend the rest of my life making sure nothing bad ever reached him. He was that kind of baby, the kind that makes you feel the full weight of love as a responsibility rather than just a feeling. And I took that responsibility with both hands and did not put it down. His mother, Caroline, left when Daniel was 4 years old, not because she was a bad person, but because she was a person who had not wanted the life she found herself inside, and she was honest about that at least, and she left cleanly and without cruelty, and we made it work in the way that two people who respect each other more than they love each other can make it work. Daniel grew up mostly with me, in the house on Birchwood Lane, and I raised him the way my own father had raised me, with high expectations and patient instruction, and the consistent daily demonstration that showing up was not optional. It was the baseline. It was the floor. It was the thing everything else got built on top of. He was a serious boy who became a serious young man, which I mean entirely as a compliment. He thought before he spoke. He finished what he started. He had a handshake at 14 that grown men remarked on. Not because I'd taught him the mechanics of it, but because he meant it, and people could feel that he meant it, and that is not something you can teach. It comes from somewhere inside a person, or it doesn't come at all. In Daniel, it came naturally and completely, and I watched it with the particular pride of a father who recognizes something in his child that did not come from him, something the child arrived with, something entirely their own. He played baseball through high school. Nothing spectacular, just solid and consistent, and always the player who made the right decision under pressure rather than the flashy one, which told you everything you needed to know about how his mind worked. He studied business at State, graduated without ceremony or drama, came back to Augusta and asked me, the summer he was 22, if he could come work at Calloway Construction, not as the owner's son. As an employee, starting at the bottom, learning the way everyone else learned. I looked at him across the kitchen table on Birchwood Lane when he said that and felt something I still don't have a precise word for. Something between pride and relief and the specific gratitude of a man who has done his best at something and gotten evidence, finally, that it worked. He spent 3 years learning the field side of the business, project management, subcontractor relationships, materials, scheduling, the physical and logistical reality of how a construction company actually functioned from the ground up. He was good at it. Not because he was my son, I was always honest with myself about that distinction, but because he was genuinely capable and genuinely committed and genuinely interested in doing the work right, rather than just getting it done. At 25, I moved him into the office. estimating first, then client relationships, then operations. By 27, he had a complete working knowledge of every part of the business, and I had begun, carefully and with intention, to include him in the conversations that mattered. The contracts, the finances, the relationships with the bank and the bonding company, and the three major clients whose work represented 60% of our annual revenue. I included him because I trusted him, because I had watched him for 5 years, and he had given me every reason to trust him and not a single reason to doubt. Because he was my son, and I had raised him, and I knew who he was. Or I believed I knew who he was, which, I would learn on a Friday morning in March, was not exactly the same thing. The Thursday night it started was ordinary in every external respect. I had been at the office until 6:30, a longer day than usual because we had a bid going out Friday morning on a medical office complex that represented the largest single contract in the company's history, something I had been working toward for 2 years, the kind of job that changes the size of what a company can become. I came home to Birchwood Lane tired and satisfied, in the quiet way of a man who has done a full day of real work, made dinner, ate it at the kitchen table with the local news on low in the other room, washed the dishes because I had washed my own dishes every night for 30 years and was not about to stop, and went to bed at 10 o'clock. I was asleep by 10:15. I know because I looked at the clock on the nightstand and registered it the way I registered small, concrete details. The habit of a man who spent his career knowing that in construction, specifics were everything and approximations got people hurt. I woke at 12:47. Not gradually, the slow surfacing of normal sleep, but suddenly and completely, the specific alertness that comes when something has crossed a threshold your sleeping mind was already monitoring. The house was quiet. The particular quiet of a house at 12:47 in the morning, deep and settled and uninterrupted. And then I heard it again, which meant I had heard it once already, in my sleep, and my mind had brought me up to meet it. A voice. Low and careful and close, coming from the direction of the garage, which was connected to the house through a door at the end of the kitchen hallway. I lay still for a moment and listened. 2 voices, I realized. Daniel's, which I knew as well as my own, and another one I didn't immediately recognize. I could not make out words yet, just the register and the rhythm of a conversation happening at a volume specifically calibrated to not be heard. I got out of bed without turning on the light, moved through the bedroom in the dark, which I could do without thinking because I had lived in this house for 23 years and knew every inch of it by feel. Into the hallway, one hand on the wall, the kitchen dark ahead of me, the thin line of light visible under the garage door at the far end. I moved toward it in my socks on the hardwood floor, and the voices got clearer as I got closer, and I stopped about 6 feet from the door, because I could hear words now, and what I heard made me stand completely still with my hand on the wall and my eyes open in the dark, and the ordinary Thursday night collapsing silently around me into something I was not going to be able to walk back from. Daniel's voice, low and deliberate. He trusts me too much. That's the whole thing. He just trusts me. A pause, then the other voice, male, younger, a voice I would place by the following morning. "You're sure about the numbers?" Daniel again. "I've been in every account. I know exactly what's there." I stood in the dark hallway of my own house and listened to my son's voice say those words, and felt something happen in my chest that I can only describe as structural. The way a building feels when something load-bearing gives way. Not a collapse yet. Just the first terrible shift of weight that tells you the collapse is coming and there is nothing left to do but brace. I did not move. I did not open the garage door. I stood there in the dark and I listened until I had heard enough, which did not take long, and then I walked back down the hallway and into the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and looked at the floor for a long time. He trusts me too much. I had said those exact words about Daniel to my banker, Frank Aldridge, not 3 weeks earlier. I had said them with pride. I had meant them as the highest possible compliment. I had meant them as evidence of everything I had built and everything Daniel had become. He trusts me too much. In my son's voice, at 12:47 in the morning, in the dark of my own garage, they meant something else entirely. And I knew, sitting on the edge of that bed, that the morning was going to require me to find out exactly what. I did not sleep again that night. I lay back on the bed and looked at the ceiling and let my mind do what it needed to do, which was not panic, not yet, but inventory. 34 years of building something from nothing teaches you that the worst thing you can do in a crisis is move. Before you understand the full dimensions of what you're dealing with, you assess first, you get accurate, then you act. So I lay there in the dark and I assessed. Daniel had been handling the company finances for 14 months. Not alone. We had a bookkeeper, a woman named Patricia Ames, who had been with Callaway Construction for 11 years and who I trusted completely. But Daniel had full access to every account, the operating account, the payroll account, the bonding reserve, the line of credit with First Southern Bank that we used to bridge cash flow between contract payments on larger jobs. I had given him that access deliberately and incrementally, the way I had given him everything in the business, earned step by step, nothing handed over before it was warranted. I had given it because every step before it had been warranted, because he had earned it completely, because he was my son, and I had watched him for 5 years and I knew who he was. He trusts me too much. I know exactly what's there. I stayed on the bed until 4:30, and then I got up because lying there was no longer useful, and I needed to think clearly, and I had never been able to think clearly lying down. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table in the dark with both hands around the mug, and I thought about the voice I hadn't recognized, and I thought about the bid going out that morning, and I thought about 14 months of access, and I thought about a 29-year-old man I had built my entire second half of life around, and I let myself feel, for exactly as long as it took to finish the cup of coffee, the full weight of what Thursday night might mean. Then I set the mug in the sink, and I went to get dressed because there was work to do, and I was not the kind of man who sat still when there was work to do. I was at the office by 6:15. The building was empty at that hour, the way I needed it to be, just the particular silence of a place that belongs to you and knows it. I sat at my desk and opened the accounting software and began to go through the numbers the way I went through everything that mattered, methodically and without rushing, and with the specific attention of a man who understood that the truth was always in the details if you were willing to look at every single one of them. I started with the operating account and worked forward from 14 months ago, which was when Daniel had taken over financial oversight, and I looked at every transaction, every transfer, every payment, every line item, and I did not let myself arrive at a conclusion before the evidence warranted one, because conclusions reached too early were conclusions reached wrong, and I had not spent 34 years building something real by being sloppy with the truth. It took me 2 hours and 40 minutes. When I was done, I sat back in my chair and looked at the screen and felt the thing I had been bracing for since 12:47 the previous night arrive completely and without any remaining room for doubt. It was not catastrophic, not yet. The amounts were not large enough for that, but what they represented was worse in some ways than the numbers themselves. 17 transfers over 14 months, each one small enough to pass without triggering automatic review, each one moving money from the operating account to an LLC I did not recognize, a company called Meridian Group Solutions that had no website, no physical address I could locate, and no relationship to any vendor, subcontractor, or supplier in our records. 17 transfers, $41,300 in total. Methodical and patient and calibrated specifically to stay below the threshold that would have made Patricia notice. calibrated by someone who knew exactly where that threshold was. Someone who had been in every account, someone who knew exactly what was there. I closed the laptop and sat in the silence of my office and looked at the photograph on the corner of my desk, the one from Daniel's college graduation, the two of us outside the stadium in the May sunshine, his cap slightly crooked, and both of us laughing at something I couldn't remember anymore, and I let myself feel it, the full and specific grief of a man who has just discovered that something he believed in completely was not entirely what he believed. Not the anger that would come, but first the grief, because the grief was honest, and the anger without the grief first was just noise, and I had never been a man who mistook noise for clarity. I picked up my phone and called Frank Aldridge at First Southern Bank at 8:55, 5 minutes before the branch opened, because Frank had been my banker for 19 years, and he picked up his personal cell for me, regardless of the hour, and I needed someone I trusted completely before I took another step. "Frank," I said when he answered, "I need to come in this morning. Before the bid goes out." Something in my voice must have told him what kind of morning it was, because he didn't ask questions. He said, "I'll be here. Come now." And that was Frank Aldridge. 19 years of exactly that, steady and present, and no wasted words. I drove to First Southern and sat across from Frank in his office with the door closed, and I walked him through everything I had found: the transfers, the LLC, the amounts, the timeline, and Frank listened the way he always listened, completely and without interrupting. And when I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Thomas, I need to show you something." He turned his monitor toward me. He had pulled up our account activity while I was talking, and there was a transfer I had not seen in the accounting software because it had been initiated the previous evening and had not yet fully processed through to the records I had been looking at. $11,000. Initiated at 11:43 p.m. on Thursday night, 36 minutes before I woke up in the dark to the sound of my son's voice in the garage. I looked at that number on Frank's screen for a long time. $11,000, initiated at 11:43 p.m., the night before the largest bid in the company's history was scheduled to go out. A bid that required our bonding capacity to be fully intact. A bid that I had spent 2 years working toward, and that represented the kind of contract that changed what a company could become. I thought about the voice I hadn't recognized in the garage. I thought about Daniel saying, "I've been in every account," with the specific confidence of a man who had been planning something for longer than one conversation. And I understood, sitting in Frank Aldridge's office at 9:20 in the morning, that Thursday night in the garage had not been the beginning of this. It had been closer to the end of a process that had been running quietly underneath everything I thought I knew for a significant portion of 14 months. Frank put a stop on the transfer before it cleared. He walked me through every protective step available: account flags, access restrictions, a formal documentation process that would create a clear record of everything. He did all of it with the calm efficiency of a man who had handled difficult things for a long time and understood that calm efficiency was the most useful thing he could offer. When it was done, he looked at me across his desk and said, "Thomas, I'm sorry. Just that. I'm sorry, not filling the space with more than it needed. Just the truth of a man who had known me for 19 years and understood what this morning cost." "I know," I said. "Thank you, Frank." He walked me to the door himself and shook my hand with both of his and held it for a beat the way serious men do when words have reached their limit. I sat in my car in the First Southern parking lot for 7 minutes before I drove back to the office. I needed those 7 minutes to decide something, which was how I was going to handle the next conversation, the one that had been building since 12:47 the previous night, and that I could not put off any longer. I had 2 choices, and I was honest with myself about both of them. I could call Daniel right now and have it over the phone, which would be faster and would spare me the physical reality of looking at my son's face while I said what needed to be said. Or I could wait until he was in front of me, in the office, where the conversation would be harder and more real, and would require more from both of us, and would therefore be more true. I had never in my life chosen the easier version of a hard thing. I was not going to start now. Daniel came in at 9:55. I heard his truck in the parking lot from my office, and I heard the front door and his voice saying something brief and easy to the receptionist, the way he did every morning, and then his footsteps in the hallway and the specific knock on my office door, 2 knocks. His knock, the one I had been hearing for 7 years in this building and for 29 years in various forms before that. "Come in," I said. He opened the door and came in with his coffee in his hand and the easy morning confidence of a man who believed the night before had gone unheard. And he looked at me, and something shifted in his face, very small and very fast, a recalibration so brief that anyone who hadn't spent 29 years watching that face would have missed it entirely. I did not miss it. "Morning," he said. "You're in early." "Close the door," I said. He closed it. He looked at me again, the recalibration happening a second time, longer now. "Dad." "Sit down, Daniel," I said. He sat in the chair across from my desk, the same chair where he had sat 7 years ago, and asked me if he could come work for me starting at the bottom and learning the way everyone else learned. And I looked at my son across the desk, and I said, "Tell me about Meridian Group Solutions." The silence that followed was the longest and most complete silence I had ever shared with another human being. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds. It felt like a season. Daniel's face went through something during those 4 seconds that I will not fully describe, because some things a father sees on his child's face belong only to him. But what settled at the end of it was not what I expected. It was not defiance. It was not the prepared composure of someone who had rehearsed for this. It was something younger and rawer and more honest than either of those things. It was the face of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just been relieved of the option of carrying it any further. He set his coffee on the edge of the desk. He put both hands flat on his knees, and he said, "How much do you know?" "All of it," I said. He nodded slowly, looking at his hands. Then he looked up at me and said, "I'm sorry, Dad." And his voice, when he said it, was the voice of my son, not the careful, low voice from the garage at 12:47, but the real one, the one I had known since he was 4 years old, and his mother had left, and he had come to find me in the kitchen and put his hand in mine without saying anything, because he didn't have the words yet, but he knew where to go. That voice, saying, "I'm sorry," in my office at 9:55 on a Friday morning in March, with $41,000 and 11 years of everything between us sitting on the desk. I looked at him for a long moment. I did not say it's okay, because it was not okay, and we both knew it, and he deserved the truth more than he deserved comfort right now. I said, "Start from the beginning," and he did. The beginning, as it turned out, was not 14 months ago. It was 22 months ago, which meant it had started 7 months before I had given Daniel full financial access, which meant the access had not created the problem. It had simply made the problem easier to execute. That was the detail that sat heaviest in me as I listened, the understanding that what I had interpreted as a gradual corruption of something good had actually been a plan that preceded the opportunity, and that the trust I had extended so carefully and so deliberately had been, at least in part, something he had been working toward rather than something he had earned naturally. I listened to my son tell me this without interrupting, because I needed the complete truth more than I needed to respond to any individual piece of it, and Daniel told it to me with the specific, exhausted honesty of a man who has been waiting, on some level, to be caught. The other voice from the garage belonged to a man named Curtis Webb, 26 years old, someone Daniel had known since college, someone I had never met and had never heard Daniel mention, which itself told me something about how deliberately this had been kept separate from everything else. Curtis had approached Daniel 22 months ago with what he described as a business opportunity, a real estate investment vehicle, a small LLC that would acquire distressed commercial properties and flip them within 18 months. The returns he projected were aggressive, but not impossible, and Daniel, who understood construction and commercial real estate better than most 29-year-olds alive, had believed they were achievable. The problem was not the concept. The problem was where Daniel had decided to get the capital. He had not taken it exactly, not in the way that word usually implies. He had structured it in his own mind as a loan, a temporary borrowing against future earnings, something he intended to repay before it was ever noticed, before it ever affected operations, before it ever became what it had become sitting on Frank Aldridge's screen at 9:20 on a Friday morning. He had told himself this so consistently and for so long that I think some part of him had genuinely believed it, which was its own kind of devastating, the specific tragedy of a smart man who had constructed a story about himself that required him to keep taking the next step to make the previous step make sense. I sat across from my son, and I listened to all of it, and I did not speak until he was finished. When he stopped talking, the office was very quiet. Outside the window, the parking lot was ordinary and bright, and a delivery truck was backing up to the building next door with its reverse alarm going at steady intervals, the completely indifferent continuation of a regular Friday morning. I looked at my son. He was looking at his hands again, both of them flat on his knees, the posture of a man waiting for a sentence. I said, "How much does Curtis Webb have of the 41,000? Daniel looked up. "About 32 of it," he said. "The rest is in the LLC account." I nodded. "Does Curtis know where the money came from?" A pause. "Not specifically," Daniel said. "He thought I had investors." I looked at him. He looked back at me with those dark and serious eyes, the ones from the February morning 29 years ago, and what was in them now was not the calculation I had been afraid I might find. It was shame, complete and undefended and real. "I know, Dad," he said quietly. "I know what I did." I stood up from my desk and walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot and the delivery truck and the ordinary Friday morning continuing in all directions. And I stood there for a while without speaking, because I needed a moment that was mine before I said what needed to be said next. 34 years, I said finally, still looking at the window. I built this from one truck and a borrowed tool belt. You know that. "Yes, sir," he said behind me. "And I brought you in because I believed in you, not because you were my son, because I watched you and I believed in who you were." "Yes, sir." I turned around. "What you did is not who I raised you to be." His jaw moved. "I know that." "Then why, Daniel?" He looked at his hands again and then back up at me, making himself do it, making himself look. "I wanted to prove I could do something on my own," he said. "Something that wasn't yours, something I built." I looked at him. "I understand that," I said. "I do. But you didn't build something, you took something, and the difference between those two things is everything I ever tried to teach you." The silence after that was different from the earlier one. That one had been the silence of exposure. This one was the silence of something landing. I watched it land on my son's face, and I did not look away because he needed to feel the full weight of it, and I was not going to spare him that by looking somewhere else. He nodded once, slowly, the nod of a man receiving something true. Then he said, "What happens now, Dad?" And his voice, when he said it, was so much younger than 29 that it reached somewhere in me I had not expected to be reached this morning. The place that had held him since the February morning he arrived and had never once let go, regardless of what this Friday morning had required of me. I sat back down at my desk. I told him what happened now. He was going to contact Curtis Webb today, in my presence, and inform him that the investment was unwinding and the capital was being returned. All of it, $32,000, by the end of the following week, by whatever means Curtis had available to him. If Curtis did not have the means, that was a problem between Daniel and Curtis, not between Curtis and Callaway Construction, and Daniel was going to solve it. Daniel was going to work with Patricia Ames to document every transfer completely and accurately, every single one, with full transparency, no omissions. The remaining $9,000 in the Meridian account was going back to the operating account today before noon, and Daniel was going to step back from financial oversight entirely, effective immediately, while I determined what the appropriate path forward looked like for both the company and for him personally. He listened to all of it without interrupting, without negotiating, without asking for any adjustment to any term, which was the first thing he had done this morning that resembled the man I had raised. When I finished, he said, "Yes, sir, to all of it." Just that. Yes, sir. I picked up the phone and called Patricia Ames and asked her to come to my office. While we waited, Daniel sat in the chair across from me, and we did not fill the silence with anything because there was nothing useful left to fill it with, and we had never been the kind of father and son who talked to avoid the weight of quiet. Patricia came in, read the room with the precise accuracy of a woman who had worked for me for 11 years, and knew every register of my professional face, and sat in the second chair without being asked. I walked her through what I needed documented, and she took notes with the focused efficiency of someone who understood that her job in this moment was accuracy and not reaction, which was exactly why she had lasted 11 years and would last 11 more. When I was done, she looked at Daniel once, briefly, with an expression that was not unkind but was completely honest. And then she looked back at me and said, "I'll have the documentation framework ready by end of day." "Thank you, Patricia," I said. She stood and left and pulled the door closed behind her. Daniel and I sat alone in the office again. The delivery truck outside was gone. The parking lot was quiet. The bid for the medical office complex had gone out at 9 o'clock that morning through our project coordinator, the largest bid in the company's history, moving forward on schedule and completely intact because Frank Aldridge had stopped the Thursday night transfer before it cleared and the bonding capacity had not been touched. That was the thing Daniel had not fully thought through, or perhaps had told himself would not matter, that the timing of the Thursday night transfer, the night before the bid, could have done damage that no repayment plan would have fixed. I did not say this to him. He was going to understand it on his own, and the understanding was going to be more useful coming from inside him than from me. "I have one more thing to say to you this morning," I said. He looked at me. "What you told me, that you wanted to build something of your own. I hear that. I understand it more than you know." He was still. "When I was 26 years old, I worked for a man named Gerald Pruitt for 4 years, and I was good at my job. And I knew I was good at my job, and I wanted something of my own so badly that I could feel it like a physical thing. And I left. I gave him 2 months' notice, and I thanked him for what I had learned, and I left and I started with 1 truck and a borrowed tool belt, and I built this." I paused. "That is how you build something of your own, Daniel. You do it with your own hands and your own risk and your own name on the line, not with someone else's money and someone else's 34 years. He looked at me for a long time. His eyes were wet, which he did not try to hide, which was the second thing he had done this morning that resembled the man I had raised. "I know, Dad," he said. "I know that now." The Curtis Webb conversation happened that afternoon in my office, on speakerphone, with Daniel doing the talking and me sitting across from him, making sure every word of it was exactly what had been agreed. Curtis was not happy. Curtis used language I will not reproduce and made implications about what he would and would not do that dissolved entirely when Daniel informed him, calmly and with the specific steadiness of a man who had nothing left to protect, that the alternative to returning the capital voluntarily and completely was a conversation with law enforcement that none of the parties in this room were going to enjoy. The call lasted 11 minutes. By the end of it, Curtis Webb had agreed to return $32,000 to an account Daniel specified by the following Friday. I made Daniel get that agreement in a text message before he hung up, because 34 years in construction had taught me that verbal agreements in uncomfortable situations had a way of becoming disputed by the following morning. Curtis sent the text. Daniel showed it to me. I nodded. I did not fire my son. I want to be precise about that decision because I have thought about it carefully and I believe it deserves precision. I did not fire him because firing him would have been the cleaner and simpler and more emotionally satisfying option, the option that required nothing further from either of us, and I had never in my life chosen the cleaner option when the harder one was more true. What I did was restructure his role entirely, removing him from anything financial, returning him to operations and client relationships where his genuine capabilities were real, and where he would have to rebuild, day by day and decision by decision, the credibility he had spent 14 months quietly dismantling. I told him this 2 weeks after the Friday morning in my office, when the $32,000 had come back from Curtis Webb and the documentation was complete, and I had had enough time to think clearly about what I actually believed, rather than what the immediate heat of the situation demanded. He listened to the new terms without negotiating a single one. He said, "I'll earn it back, Dad." I said, "I know you will," because I still believed that. Not blindly, not the way I had believed it before, the easy belief of a man who had never had reason to look closely, but the harder, clearer belief of a man who had looked at everything and chosen, with full information and open eyes, to continue. My father used to say that trust was not a thing you gave once and kept forever. He said it was a thing you rebuilt every morning with your actions, the same way you made your bed or brushed your teeth, a daily practice with no days off and no credit carried forward from the day before. I thought he was being unnecessarily hard about it when I was young. I understood what he meant completely by the time I was sitting at my kitchen table on Birchwood Lane on a Saturday morning 3 weeks after the Friday in the office, drinking my coffee and watching the March light come through the window and thinking about 34 years and 29 years and the specific cost of loving someone enough to hold them accountable instead of just holding them. That is the harder love. It does not feel like love in the moment. It feels like loss and grief and the terrible weight of seeing someone you raised clearly rather than as you wish they were. But it is love. It is the deepest and most demanding version of it, and it is the only version I have learned that actually builds something that lasts. Daniel knocked on the door of the house on Birchwood Lane that same Saturday morning at 10 o'clock. He had called ahead, which he had not always done before, which was itself a small and deliberate thing. He came in and sat across from me at the kitchen table, where he had sat his whole life, where he had done homework and eaten breakfast, and asked me at 22 if he could come work for me, starting at the bottom, and we drank coffee together in the March light, without making it more than it needed to be. He did not ask for forgiveness, which was correct, because forgiveness was not a thing you asked for at a kitchen table on a Saturday morning. It was a thing you earned back the same way trust was earned, daily, with your actions, with no days off and no credit carried forward. He knew that now. I could see that he knew it. And that, for a Saturday morning in March, with the light coming through the window and my son sitting across from me, was enough to begin with. Some things you build from the ground up. Some things you have to tear down first to understand what was worth keeping. The foundation of what Daniel and I had was still there. I had checked it the way I checked every foundation, carefully and without wishful thinking, and it was solid. What we built on top of it from that Saturday forward was going to be different from what had been there before, more honest, more clear-eyed, more real, which meant in the end more worth having. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything.